Oliver Burkeman, thank you for being here.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
So as we move into quarter four, I spent Monday reviewing my goals for the year, and I had these big ambitions for the year, and I'll be honest, I'm nowhere hitting most of them, right? Many of the goals I set for this year, I'm not going to achieve. And so the kind of hyper optimistic productivity bro within me would say that that means that I'm a terrible, flawed person and that, I'm not going to get anywhere in this life because I didn't manage to hit these goals. But your school of thought would say something different. What would you say?
I would say that, it's tempting to say, yes, you're a terribly flawed person and you should feel bad just because it would be funny. But no, I would say that, we have an extraordinary tendency to choose far more goals than the finite amount of time we have in a life, let alone in a quarter, is ever going to permit us to complete. And, it's pretty much baked in because we have these minds that can conceive of 50 things that would be great to do over the next 3 months, and can conceive of somehow feeling like they must be possible to do them all, and or most of them or something. And this just has no relationship to the finite time that we have in which to do them. So the only thing I would and do recommend is that you sort of admit defeat on a whole lot of these goals at the beginning of the quarter rather than at the end, right? And just sort of accept that as sequential, as beings who must just do things in sequential time. Like, most of the things you want to do will not be getting done in any given period of time. That's not a problem. That's just the way it is.
And where do you think this tendency comes from? Because I'm not going to pretend to be some wise elder, but I've been planning my years for a few years in a row now. And it seems that at the beginning of every year, I make these goals. And I'm certain that this time around, I've done it right. This time around, I'm not being too optimistic. I'm definitely going to get all of this done. And, it was just, it was a scheduling issue. It was a hobbies issue, right? But invariably, every year, I get it wrong. We seem to overestimate our abilities in the medium term. Is that right?
Yeah, I think there's lots of reasons for why we set the target so high, and there are certainly reasons to do with the economy and the society in which we live and the pressures that we feel from the culture, the way we're raised, all sorts of different things. But the bit that really interests me, I suppose, is just like, what's the motive that we have for not sort of focusing as closely as we might on the finite capacities that we have. And I think if you go really deep down to the very bottom of it, it's basically not wanting to die. It's basically not wanting to be mortal, and to accept that life involves choices. It involves putting aside things that really matter, right? Not just putting aside the stuff that doesn't really matter to focus on the stuff that really matters, but putting aside a good chunk of the things that really matter as well. So I think the sort of motivation there is, as others have said, it feels really unpleasant to fully sort of feel yourself in the situation that we are in as humans. And so an awful lot of what passes for goal setting advice and productivity systems and all the rest of it is really just an exercise in getting better and better at not feeling the truth of our situation, which is sort of short-term comfort, but in the long term is no way to live and is actually less productive, as we can explore if you're interested. But yeah.
Do you remember when you had that unlock, right? Because much of your work revolves around this idea of kind of accepting our shortcomings, accepting our limited time on this earth. But as I say, so many of us assume that we have infinite amounts of time and we can get infinite amounts done. Is there an anecdote or a story where one day you woke up and you're like, actually, this to-do list is never going to end. I'm never going to get everything done, and so I should live my life accordingly?
Yeah, there was. I write about this in 4,000 Weeks. I do want to preface it by saying it was very much an intellectual epiphany. The bit where you actually live into the new way of thinking takes forever. Still is not, complete. But I write in that book about, back in pretty much a decade ago now. I don't remember exactly, but sitting on a park bench in Brooklyn where we lived at the time, having stopped on the way to the co-working space where I worked, in a week where I was even more sort of overburdened by deadlines and the things that I felt I had to do that week, and sitting there sort of trying to figure out what combination of productivity techniques and less sleep and cancelling all social engagements. Like what combination of things could finally enable me to get through all these things? And just being struck very forcefully by the realization, oh, it's impossible. Oh, I'm trying to do something that's impossible. And finding that to be an enormous liberation, actually, because it's really hard to keep beating yourself up for something that you've realized is as impossible as making 2 + 2 add up to 5, or jumping 2 miles in the air or something, right? You can't do it, and it's silly to expect that you could have done it. And the really interesting thing about that, which I think sometimes takes a bit of explaining, is that wasn't followed by some feeling of like, what's the point in doing anything then? That was followed by the thought, okay, now I'm free to use the time that I do have to work on the things that are actually most important, that I can, as far as I can figure out. And that might be partly to do with their urgency and how much impatience other people were feeling for me to finish them, or it might be much more to do with what really, really matters the most to me. But either way, like, okay, now I can take these decisions because I'm not involved in this crazy, futile struggle to achieve something that is just not going to be achieved. Yeah. So that was one moment.
And actually, that's a nice segue to lean into this idea of imperfectionism, because it sounds like on that bench, as you intellectualize this idea and attempted at least to begin living by it, you were leaning into this idea of imperfectionism. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so imperfectionism in the new book, Meditations for Mortals, imperfectionism is my sort of umbrella term. It's good to have like a proprietary term for the thing you're trying to explain, right? It helps with the branding, but it's a real thing. It is, I think, the sort of overall outlook on life and approach to life that starts from this kind of surrender or apparent defeat, right? That starts from the fact that there will always be too much to do, and says, okay, now what? It starts from the fact that that's not the only limitation, right? There's the fact that we can never fully understand other people, the fact that we can never really feel completely like we know what we're doing in our jobs or as parents or as partners, the fact that the world is sort of beset by multiple unfolding crises that don't appear to be going away anytime soon, right? To take all of that mess and that catastrophe and that limited capacities that we have in that context and just say, okay, that's the situation. Now how do we do a whole bunch of cool stuff that is meaningful and enjoyable and makes a difference to other people? Like, how do we do that in that situation? Instead of, I think, what so many of us are doing, and I was certainly doing for years, unconsciously anyway, which is sort of trying to get through stuff until we get to that future point where everything's sorted out and we know what we're doing and we got our systems in place and we've got the security, psychological, financial, whatever that we were seeking, and now we can just sort of have the smooth ride that we felt we were always entitled to. So imperfectionism is sort of inherently very active way of thinking about the world, because it's about taking imperfect action now, really, really, really. The word actually appears an awful lot in the book, even though my editor made me take some of them out, as opposed to what I think we're so prone to do, and a lot of bad personal development literature enables us in doing, which is sort of building up these really complicated fantasies of how perfectly brilliant things are going to be when we get there in the future.
There's a strange kind of Fiat 500, the secret style mantra that has popped into my head as a result of reading your book, but it's one that's been incredibly useful, right? Which was a few days ago when I got to the end of the book, I woke up and I'm like, look, if I'm going to change my life, it's going to be today, with all of the imperfections, with all of the nuisances. Like today, for example, I woke up late to begin with, not ideal. I looked at my phone, I had 2 emails which were just pure stress and I didn't need them today. Then we were just about to record this and it turns out that I'd sent you off to the wrong link somewhere and my microphone wasn't working just before you arrived. But almost embracing the fact that, like, this is how every day is going to be. And I've never woken up and it's tomorrow. It's always going to be today, and today is always going to be like this. Yeah. So just accepting that for what it is seems really useful. Yeah, and I think I guess the thing I'm always sort of on a mission to try to drive home, people are quite prone, not you by the sound of things, but people are quite prone to then taking this to mean like, well, what's the point in doing anything?
You have to settle for mediocre output because you can't get the perfect output. And I really, really disagree with that. I think that this is the way to do the most impressive and amazing and meaningful things of which any of us is capable. And the path that is some version of perfectionism is the way to never quite do it, and to always be hanging back, either not taking action or not fully feeling immersed in the action that you're taking or something. And it is, as I say, I'm a work in progress, but it is so freeing to see that actually you didn't need to choose between a sort of peaceful and calm life and an accomplished and productive one. They're the same thing once you drop this thought that you've got to fix something first before you can really call yourself a sort of adequate and acceptable human being.
And so I want to dive into some of the themes in the book, but before we do, like I said, I've just finished reading it, Meditations for Mortals, and I closed the book feeling somewhat reassured, right? Because I look at your latest book and even 4,000 Weeks. I look at, Slow Productivity by Cal Newport. I look at Feel Good Productivity by Ali. And it seems that the productivity zeitgeist, if there even is such a thing, is shifting, right? It's moving away from this kind of 2018, 1920, like hyper optimization, hyper productivity, time box, everything, to something a little bit more manageable. Is that a fair way to assess where we are in society right now?
I think so. I mean, it's always tempting to sort of locate oneself at the vanguard of a new way of thinking. I get that, but even so, no, I think that there is a sense of a sort of a threshold having been reached, right? Of a sense that we have got to an extraordinary level in our capacity to sort of self-optimize and to reduce the time that things take, and to be able to reach more and more and more people with a single keystroke in what we're doing, if we're that kind of person doing creative stuff, and finding that none of these things actually get us to the point where everything is smooth sailing and all the problems go away, and in many cases seem to make things worse. Within my fairly, not even my adult lifetime, but the most recent bit of my adult lifetime, I feel like burnout was a thing that you complained about, late 40s, 50s, and now you have people talking about it in their 20s, and maybe they're over dramatizing in certain ways, but there is that sense of like everyone's sort of reached a kind of a wall in the idea that just going faster is going to help us find sort of peace of mind and meaning and good work in this particular phase of capitalism. So I think that is what that productivity literature is responding to. I mean, I sort of divide the whole field into at least two parts, right? And there are people who are coming at this from a very specifically sort of critical of the system approach, which reaches its sort of extreme in the kind of anti-work movement and things like that, which is like all of this is just a waste. And then there are people, very much including I think Cal and Ali, who are trying to sort of salvage the notion of productivity as meaning something good and worth doing that isn't just sort of frenetic optimization. I guess in the way we all have, I sort of think of myself as on the boundary between those two, but that's just inevitable. I think they are sort of two interesting streams. And if you've read Jenny Odell's work, I think that would be Saving Time and How to Do Nothing was the first book of hers that came to my notice. And that's a much more sort of like, maybe this whole idea of measuring our lives by any kind of production is just a mistake. And then there are the people who are saying like, well, no, it's fine to want to be that kind of productive, but something's clearly gone wrong with how we think about it. I think there's wisdom in both sides, really. Yeah.
And this is the idea I was going to land on, actually. It's almost like somewhere in the middle of those two extremes is where the truth lies, as is the case with everything, right? Because 5 years ago when I launched this podcast, there were literally episodes with titles like How I Plan My Day, as if anybody would care about that, right? But I was the person who was living minute to minute in a calendar with a to-do list and kind of subscribing to every single productivity hack I could. For example, I had like 20 habits that I would tick off in a spreadsheet every single day. And I know you speak about this idea in the book and how it's been misattributed, the never break the chain idea. But I realized as I kind of strayed further away from that and focused on like just doing very basic, simple things. Like I'm very privileged to be able to say this. I run my own business. So like I normally get to the office at 11 a.m., right? Any productivity book telling you to wake up at 10:15 a.m. just wouldn't sell copies. And then I kind of do 2 or 3 things. I kind of potter around a bit. But when I zoom out and look at my overall output, today, right now, when it seems like I'm doing far less with far fewer stabilizers, with far fewer kind of exciting, shiny things, I'm actually getting way more done. So it's almost like somewhere in between those 2 extremes is actually where we should be landing, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think that it's very much a question of, I mean, what you said that makes what you just said, what it makes me think of is the parts of my most recent book about sort of the role of rules and systems in life, and the fact that I think, there is nothing wrong with having a whole selection of interesting techniques and ways of planning your day and all the rest of it that you pick from at the appropriate moment. The problem for those of us who've gone sort of peered over the productivity abyss in our past is that you start to think one or more of those methods is going to kind of basically be your salvation. Actually, on quite a deep level, it's very interesting to me. I think it is almost the desire to find a rule or a system where we could say, look, I'll be a really good boy and follow every single bit of this rule perfectly. In return, I want the rule to like live life for me and confront the challenges and eliminate emotional upheaval and just like, and I think that's why it partly appeals to the kind of people who weren't like always handed their homework in on time and stuff at school, and of which I certainly was one. But actually, there can be no rule that does that. I think that one of the things that one finds, maybe not you, but certainly me, when I did those kind of very detailed, strict schedules, is that within about a day, they just feel incredibly dead and lifeless, and like I don't want to do them. And like, who's this guy telling me I have to spend my day in this? Oh, it's me from 2 days ago. But all the same, like I hate that guy. And I think what's going on there is that, yeah, I thought this would lead to plain sailing, and it turns out that actually a meaningful life is one where you're actually spontaneously engaging with what's happening fully, or as fully as you can, in every moment. So I'm all for productivity systems and techniques, but I'm much happier and I think more productive now that I kind of cycle through them and see what works for a while. And there's still a little bit of me in the back of my mind that is like, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the one that's going to work forever. But I don't really believe that voice anymore. So I just use it for as long as it seems useful, and then, put it down and try something else.
I spoke again recently with Rory Sutherland, and we were talking broadly about this idea of hyper optimization. And I think he referred to it as a new form of Puritanism, drawing this kind of religious connotation between how people swear by this particular kind of guide to their life. And it's so interesting hearing him say that when you connect it to the idea that it's some way us avoiding our mortality and our limited nature on this earth. It's just really interesting to hear the two of you from such different places arrive at a very similar idea.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I think it's not only a sort of a parallel to a religion, it comes directly from a lot of it, right? I think the sort of Calvinist influence on the European mind is very, very important here. This notion that either if you do enough good works, you'll get to heaven, or actually what it really is if you're already destined for heaven, then you would be the kind of person who does a lot of productive activity. So you better do a lot of productive activity to prove to yourself that you're already destined to go to heaven. I mean, what a complicated psychodrama. But there's that, and then yes, there's this idea of salvation, of transcendence, of somehow rising out of the human condition, and it sounds like a very sort of abstract and philosophical thing to talk about in the context of apps that help you process your email more rapidly. But I think in all of those apps and all our urge to use those systems, there often is this sort of hidden fantasy of achieving kind of escape velocity, right? Getting so optimized that nothing would feel like any effort, and that you'd have time for everything and never have to disappoint anybody. and never have to neglect any sort of ambition or obligation that could possibly come your way, which is sort of a proxy for immortality, right? Because that would be effectively not to have to die. And so I do think it's quite a religious vision deep in that sort of traditional productivity stuff.
So let's dive into some of the ideas that you talk about, meditations for mortals. And I kind of want to approach each of these through the lens of slightly odd behaviors that your writing has inspired within my life, but behaviors that have worked nonetheless, right? So you made me realize recently that I've been kind of toying with an idea of your done list inadvertently for a while. And I do this through the medium of chatting to myself in the car whilst I drive home, literally having a conversation with myself, because, you know, between the typical pressures that we all have, right, of living life and life admin and running a business and this content and podcast and everything, my to-do list every day would be, say, 20 items, and I'd get 13 of them done, and I'd be really stressed about the 7, which were the balance that get carried over into tomorrow, and I would always be in this, as you call it, productivity debt feeling, right? But a few months ago, started driving home, and I was like, let's just try and talk, as I do. People have an internal monologue. Apparently, I have an external one when alone. I'm like, let's just talk about what's gone well today, right? What I've done well. And I don't mean this in some sort of like gratitude journaling way. Literally just kind of matter of fact. Today, for example, I'll be like, I woke up and I dealt with that fire that a client was having, and then Oliver and I had a good conversation, and that's going to be great when it comes out, and so on. It's almost like I've been plotting a done list out loud, and you advocate for something very similar. So tell me about what a done list is. Yeah,
well, firstly, can I just say I also talk out loud to myself when nobody's listening. So there's certainly, I think I fully endorse this. I'm glad that that's led to that behaviour. But the done list is just what it sounds like: a list of a list one keeps alongside or instead of a to-do list, where you write down the things that you have completed through the day as you complete them. And the logic is pretty straightforward here. I think we are completely prone to comparing whatever we've done to the list of things that we could hypothetically do, which is effectively infinite. So you're never going to come up with a good judgment about yourself by making that comparison. And the done list just sort of reorients one's focus onto all the things that are away from that, and compares what you've done implicitly to how much you would have done if you'd done nothing today. So every single additional item on a done list is a good and positive thing, and another reason not to only compare yourself to that sort of infinite and unachievable amount. And I also just think anything that brings you back down into the world of the things you're actually doing, instead of the sort of... It's very easy to spend day after day of what feels like real life in a fantasy, right? A fantasy of just one more push, bit more self-discipline, couple more hours, and I'll get to these sunlit uplands. And a done list is another thing that says, like, well, no, because there are 20 items on this done list, not infinity. But on the other hand, that's something of real value, right? That's 20 things you really did. It also has this interesting effect that is well known in psychology. I'm blanking on its usual label, but whereby if you know you're going to be putting things on your done list, you're slightly more likely to choose worthwhile things to do, because you'd quite like to accumulate a good list of completed activities. So that's also another part of it. All in all, I just think anything that brings you back down into the world of the finite is going to help you achieve more things in reality.
Something else I like about the done list is, let me rewind a little bit, right? So I speak a lot on this podcast to people about what they believe our default states are, right? So I speak to Nick Butter, the man who's ran a marathon in every country around the world. He says, well, our default state is outside running, right? Of course he would. The people who advocate for eating non-ultra processed foods would be like, well, our default state is eating real whole foods. But the more I look at my attempts to get more done in life, the more I begin to realize that, at least for me, I certainly don't speak for you here, although you might agree, my default state when it comes to productivity is like an unambitious, tired, lazy waste man who doesn't want to get anything done. And so when it's that guy staring at a list of 7 items still aren't done, it reinforces it, right? Like, oh, I'm a terrible person. It's so bad. I'm never going to get anything done. Whereas if I sit there as the unproductive, lazy waste man and look at the 12 things that I did do today, immediately I have evidence that conception I have of myself, of my default state, is not true, right? And compound that over enough days, and I believe it's enough to actually shift an identity.
I'm so glad to hear that you put it like that, and I think you're right. And I think, that is a belief we can have about our default state. I think a lot of us do, that we sort of need to keep kicking ourselves in the backside. Otherwise, the first thing we do would just be nothing. Even though, of course, the evidence is all against that. And anyone who's even in that particular psychological place in the first place is not going to have that problem, right? If you're tormenting yourself with what you haven't done, then you're almost not, by definition, not someone who doesn't care about, who's prone to not bothering to get things done. I also think on a really deep level, there's a quote in the book from the Zen teacher Kosho Uchiyama, who has this slightly cryptic but I think brilliant quote, life unhindered by anything manifests as pure activity. And I think what this means, or one of the things that this means, is that in some sense it's action that is our default state, right? In some sense we are just a bundle of transient processes doing something all the time, and a meaningful life is just a question of whatever sort of mysterious influence you can exert over which activities you're doing and which you aren't. But in fact, a lot of what gets in our way is sort of things that we add into the system because we don't trust that if we just sort of chilled out a bit, the action would follow naturally. So we then bring in all these kinds of complex straitjackets of scheduling and goal setting that, for various reasons, let's discuss if you like, but for various reasons actually, sort of interfere with the natural unfolding of action. That's another reason why anyone who has the autonomy in their professional situation to do it should really try, at least for a couple of days, navigating through the day on the basis of what they feel like doing. And just check if it's really the case that what you always feel like doing is being a total irresponsible human being, wasting your time and doing nothing, or finding out that actually you kind of do really want to do most of the things that really matter to you, just possibly in a different order than your time management system was trying to dictate.
There's a similar idea there, although his is far, far more abstract, and I really struggled with the book, although there was nuggets in there, from The Surrender Experiment by Michael Singer. And his book is essentially, for those who haven't read it, is this idea that he surrendered his life to the flow of life and saw what happened, right? And when you go big and broad and abstract and suggest that you do that over an 80-year period, it's quite hard to grapple with, whereas what you're suggesting of just trying it for a couple of days, of just kind of, sure, do what you need to do, but see what takes your fancy, follow the flow, listen to your body, listen to your mind, listen to these things that are actually there to tell you in the moment what you should and shouldn't do, not the, as you say, the to-do list that the guy 2 days ago made that you immediately resent right now.
Yeah, no, I think it is all part and parcel on some level with the subject matter of the surrender experiment and of sort of surrendering to reality. I think the really important thing to see is that, your desires and your moods are part of that reality. And, at the very least, why not try to find a way to harness the energy of what you really feel like doing right now, instead of what a lot of productivity techniques do, I think, which is sort of provide systems for suppressing those desires. I love Michael Singer's work. If I ever get to have a conversation with him, I really want to ask him about the surrender stuff, because it does seem very interesting to me. It seems that there are a lot of junctures in that book where I couldn't quite figure out why choosing one option would be the surrendering option versus the other one. And I'm really interested in how he thinks about that concept. To me, and the reason I probably don't use the word surrender all that much, it's just about being more conscious of the way things actually are, the whole way things actually are. Sure, your deadlines and your ambitions and your goals, but also your moods and your energy levels and what your kids are asking of you and what the world is asking, and just taking it all in the round and trying to go with where the energy is, where you can. I'm not saying you maybe never have to sort of push yourself to do something, but not living life in this constant mode of trying to sort of overmaster the part of your reality that wants to do fun things and wants to enjoy themselves.
So another of your ideas from the book that seems particularly important in this day and age is the idea that we can't care about everything, right? So I have this group chat with two of my friends, Peter and Adam, and it comes alive the instant one country begins lobbing missiles at another, right? I look at my phone and invariably, yep, there it is. Somebody said, oh my God, it's World War III. And
Yeah.
really, I've learned not to care for two reasons. Number one, because thankfully it's not World War III, who would have guessed? But number two, because a few years ago I spoke to Nir Eyal and he discussed this idea of just kind of switching off the news, not paying attention to it, right? Because we have a limited resource when it comes to what we can care about, what we can invest our attention and our energy into. And so I took very literally what he said. I do not watch the news. I do not read the news. I've unfollowed all of those lovely journalists on Twitter. And as a byproduct of that, I feel like I now have the capacity to actually care about the things that I want to care about, or indeed, I now have the capacity to care about anything rather than this kind of fragmented, pretend, performative care that most of us seem to be doing. So tell me more about this idea that we can't care about everything.
Yeah, I mean, you've expressed part of it very well. I think, and as you know, we live in an attention economy where everything clamours for one's attention, where every media organisation and activist group, even all the most honourable of them, is just incentivised to make their cause or their story of the day seem like the most important thing that's ever happened. We're just connected through the sheer connectivity of digital life, to more suffering and human woe and conflict than anyone in history ever had to think about. I then don't extrapolate from that to say switch off the news, but I think that's a personality thing rather than some sort of overriding clash of principles. I just say this is proof that you have to pick your battles, right? This is proof that you can only care about a certain number of things if you wish to have an effect on any of them. I personally would say those things absolutely could include aspects of the crises unfolding in the news, but then it's a question of okay, what local group are you going to volunteer with? What cause that you have studied the effectiveness of are you going to give some money to? If you're someone who sort of writes and communicates, what do you think you can actually add to what specific issue that's unfolding in the world? As opposed to, yes, this kind of scattered attention, dissipated, generalized kind of emoting and panicking about the state of the world that does have some payoffs because it is sort of rewarded in a way in social media spaces to be showing that you're caring about everything, but doesn't actually help the things you're either pretending or genuinely do care about. So I think it's just the sort of overarching point here that accommodates my approach and the switch off the news completely approach is that there are huge trade-offs of attention to be made and no benefit in pretending to yourself or trying to convince yourself that there aren't. And then everyone has to make those trade-offs where they feel comfortable. But it certainly isn't the case that if you're someone who decides not to pay attention to the sort of parlous health of democracy in the world today or something, that makes you a bad person. I would say that if there's any meaning in the judgment of whether you're a bad person or not, it can only come from looking at all the things you are doing with your time and your attention.
And so getting a bit more tactical on that one, given, like you say, that our entire economy is based on attention and whether it's the news, whether it's charitable organizations, whether it's our friend who's having a bake sale, everybody's competing for our care and our wanting, right? Yeah. Given that we have this innate desire to care, do you suggest stripping everything back and then seeing, I guess, what sticks? Do you kind of pick out the things that align with your values? How do you as an individual decide what it is that reaches that barometer level of, yep, right, okay, now I'm going to invest my time and attention into this?
Well, firstly, it's a constant struggle on some level, right? I am still looking for the right way to use social media. I'm not quite willing, maybe I should be, but I'm not quite willing to go the Cal Newport route and just take that out of my life completely. On those occasions when I have done, the effects have been quite positive, so maybe I'm just, the solution is staring me in the face here. But I think I also find a lot of value in the kind of conversations that can happen there, and I'm always looking for the sort of strategy that makes it all work better than it currently does. But in terms of the things that do work for me successfully, I think it is less about setting up boundaries and blocking things out. It is that partly. So it is about, apps, not having social media on your phone and all those sorts of things. It is about famous advice like, think you get more from reading weekly and monthly publications usually than from trying to keep up moment to moment with what's happening through the course of a day, because actually there's too much noise in that signal to fully figure out what really matters. Reading more sort of analytical coverage of those things rather than the breaking news about them. But the other thing is just to sort of crowd that stuff out by the thing or things that you are focusing on. So David Brooks somewhere has this wonderful line about how the way to focus is not to sort of, I totally mess up this quote, but like not to sort of renounce everything else in your life, but to find something you that sort of obsesses you to a terrible degree and let it crowd out all the other things. So I think there's a lot to be said for just making sure that there are things that there's time and space for the things that you are obsessed with. And then just one more thought, more to do with sort of day-to-day productivity than with sort of which causes to care about and stuff, is just any approach to productivity that involves limiting your work in progress, that involves saying, these are the 3 or 4 things that I'm concentrating on now. This is the list of 50 things that I'm going to make wait until it's time for them. That general feel is really powerful for me, that idea of like really deciding that all sorts of things that are worth my attention are going to sit on that list that's called to think about later on or something like that until I've done these 3 or 4 things.
Another of your ideas that I've been thinking about a lot recently is the idea of there being no such thing as a fresh start, right? So I was on my way to give a talk in Loughborough a few weeks ago, and my talks from the Life and Lessons podcast follow the structure of like, here are 8 lessons. So I'm kind of fortunate in the sense that I can just pick them as I go, right? I can make up what they're going to be. And I arrived in Loughborough having driven for 4 hours, and I got to the venue and I opened my laptop and I changed one of the thoughts there and then, because I'd realized that for the past 28 years of my life, I've been lying to myself about something every single time I say I'll start on Monday, right? I will fix my diet on Monday. I'll go to the gym again on Monday. I'll move back in line with my personal budget again on Monday, because I guess in shorthand, that is saying, I don't know, despite it being Tuesday afternoon, I'll spend the next 6 weeks sinking further into this negative behavioral pattern and then outsource the responsibility of fixing this thing that I can't be bothered fixing right now to a lesser version of myself who's eaten more or spent more or moved less, right? So as I got to this talk, I decided to Google where a week comes from. And this is my new hot take that I'd love your views on with the idea of fresh takes, right? I believe that a week isn't real. And so just as I got to that venue, I typed into Google, where does a week come from? And the top result on Google, top result because clearly we do in-depth research on this podcast, says this. It says, our use of the 7-day week can be traced back to the astronomically gifted Babylonians and the decree of King Sargon I of Akkad around 2300 BC. Now, if I said to you, I don't know, I've eaten this donut on a Tuesday afternoon, so for the next 6 days I'm going to ruin my diet because then it's Monday, you'd be like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. I've heard somebody say that before. That checks out. If I said to you, I've eaten this donut on a Tuesday, for the next 6 days I'm going to ruin my diet because in 2300 BC, King Assad of the Babylonians, you'd be like, this guy's lost his mind, right? You'd be like, what is this guy speaking about? And it seems to be this idea that we're drawn to fresh starts, right? Why not Tuesday afternoon beginning again? Why not Wednesday morning? Where does our desire for fresh starts come from? And why can't we just begin again now?
It's so well put. I think I'm right in saying, I should know this, but I think I'm right in saying that the week is the only sort of purely and obviously socially constructed of the sort of main divisions of time. Obviously, a year and a month and a day have relations to the movements of the planets and the sun and the moon, and the decision to take one of those months and chop it up into 4 and call it the fundamental building block of life, and to sort of tell the story of the creation of the world on the basis of a week and everything is all a human thing. I think that obviously the allure of a fresh start, whether it happens on a Monday or even, sometimes you get into this situation. I remember earlier in my life of thinking like, well, if the morning's gone wrong, I can start again at 12 noon, but I can't start again at 2:30 p.m., right? That's wrong. Something about that is wrong. Whatever it is. The allure is clearly that you can use your will to kind of cut away from all the things that have gone before and make it perfect from now on. You find this in kind of, it's basically the same idea in kind of incredibly sinister contexts, like the idea of kind of year zero in violent revolutions. I think the Khmer Rouge had a whole thing about like starting the calendar afresh, and obviously it always, in that context, is incredibly bloody and murderous. But the same idea is like, it's the idea that the human will could, like, now we can shape things the way we want from here on out. And the simple point that I always make in the context of personal development, not on the political stage, is that, like, there's something really strange about the idea of a fresh start, because it's the idea that you want to sort of make your personality different from now on, but the personality putting it into place is you, right? It's the old version of you. The new you that you're trying to bring into the world will be created, engineered into existence by the old you. So it's sort of like Baron Munchausen in the old German stories trying to pull himself out of a swamp by his own hair or by the laces of his own boots, right? This is obviously not going to work. Wherever you go, there you are, right? As the saying goes, you're going to find that if you're, just in the simplest way, like, if you're so sort of entangled with your issues around procrastination that you want a fresh start where no procrastination from now on, well, that fresh start, that urge for fresh start, is a symptom of that psychodrama, but it's not a solution to it, because clearly there's something that needs to be examined there that is not going to be examined by that kind of just wipe the thing clean. And just the final thing that I'll say, I really love the insight of the therapist Bruce Tift, who suggests that actually you could think of this almost as the exact opposite of a fresh start, which is to take whatever it is that bothers you the most about yourself at the moment. Let's say it's procrastination, right? And then think to yourself, well, what would it feel like to know that I was going to be afflicted by some version of this problem just for the rest of my life? I was never going to get rid of it completely. What if I was always going to be a bit too anxious about things that don't really need me to be anxious about them, or a bit too prone to having a sort of touchy and angry response to people who I think are not paying me enough respect, or whatever it is? A lot of people find that really liberating, because it's like, oh, okay, I can just get on with I can be a procrastinator and get on with my projects, instead of this notion that first of all I've got to figure out how to solve my procrastination before I can get on with my projects.
Which is another nice segue, as it happens, into another of your ideas and just getting on with things. Right now, I fear that I've butchered this, but let's talk about kayaks and super yachts, because I may have taken this slightly too literally, but nonetheless, there's been an interesting result, as seems to be the theme of this conversation, right? So in listening to you explain kayaks and super yachts and these kind of two different approaches to life, in the middle of every one of my days, including today, in the past, say, week, so still TBC if this is practically useful in the future, I've just carved out this little bit of time that I began calling kayak time. There you go, another proprietary term, where I just dump a bunch of kind of uncertain, unconnected to anything, not really sure if this is going to go anywhere, but something I've probably been avoiding nonetheless, and that would be good to do tasks into the middle of the day that in a kind of guilt-free, slightly passive way, I just tackle for the sake of tackling them, right? There's no grand plan to this. And I think that that's a really interesting way to approach this kind of reframing. So tell me about the difference between a super yacht and a kayak.
Yeah, I like that strategy. This metaphor, analogy, whatever, I just used to sort of bring in the contrast between how life is as a finite human and how we would wish it was. I think that our situation as human beings in time and with our limitations is like being on a little one-person kayak on a fairly rapidly moving river, right? You're there, the water of time is passing away under you, whether you like it or not. You're very sort of vulnerable to what might happen. The best you can do is sort of react to what's coming and try to steer as best you can in the situation that you are. Things could go terribly wrong at any moment, but meanwhile you just sort of have to keep navigating in the way that seems the most sort of the wisest to you. And that's just sort of totally who we are as humans, right? With our limited amount of time, limited control over time, limited knowledge of the future, of what's coming, all the rest of it. I think what we would really want most of the time is a much greater level of sort of serene control over our lives. And the image there is that we would like to be on the sort of bridge of one of those, I don't know, 140-foot super yachts where you program the destination into the ship's computers, and then you sit back in a kind of plush swivel stool or whatever. I'm not super intimately acquainted with actual super yachts, I should probably say. And then, you can just sit there in the peaceful quiet and the stillness and think excitedly about how great it's going to be at your destination. And life just proceeds. And I think that's the promise of a lot of personal development stuff, productivity techniques, right? It's sort of get you to that super yacht position. And I think it's really useful to remind oneself that actually you can't ever get there. You're always in the kayak. Even if you're an incredibly rigid and driven person who is following an incredibly granular schedule for how to use every 5 minutes of your life or something, actually what you're doing is spontaneously deciding to keep following that in every new second, right? You're still in the kayak, even though you're trying to create this fantasy of being in the super yacht. So what I take you to be doing with that idea of kayak time is just to be saying, like, look, this is what life is. So for a short period of time, what if I really owned that and just like dived in, probably a bad metaphor in the context of kayaks, but anyway, and plunged forward with these few tasks without trying to fit them into any sort of grand programmed scheme, because then, who knows where one or two of those might lead. And it's incredibly difficult to let yourself do that, to allow yourself to just do something once because maybe it'll be useful or a good way to spend your time, instead of trying to figure out how it belongs to your grand program of, getting your life in working order and ultimately sort of saving your soul. Yeah.
I know that we need to wrap this up in about 8 minutes. There are 2 ideas that I want to explore very finally. And the first of which, I'm really keen not to sound like a terrible person in the way I set this up, so bear with me here, right? But there are some of us, for example, like the kind of people who would select to pick up your book, or the kind of people who would select to be 52 minutes into this conversation between the two of us, who I guess are in a way a negative disposition in life because we're trying so hard to be winners, right? And what I mean by that, and look, this is where I might sound terrible, so I apologize if I do, but I look at many people who I went to school with, right? And they have the comfortable 9 to 5, and they go home to their wife and their 2 children, and the dinner's on the table like an hour later, and they watch the TV, and they just seem to be really settled and really happy. And it's not that they're not, I mean, sure, they're not pushing, but they're not being kind of pushed, and they're not feeling the physical and mental strain of pushing. They're not left wanting as much, and it's not like they're not living in the gap or the gain. They're just kind of living. So is it us, the people who perhaps rightly or wrongly have slightly loftier ambitions, who are the ones who have it all wrong? Are we the real losers in life?
I think the answer is yes and no. It's a great question, and I don't judge you for it. The phrase that is so useful here in the psychological literature is insecure overachievers, right? Is people, I certainly count myself. I'm sure there are plenty, I'm willing to guess, in the audience for this conversation, who do a whole bunch and who are driven and who are maybe sort of celebrated by other people and applauded by other people for doing it, who've achieved plenty of great stuff in their lives, but who are doing it on some level to try to feel okay about themselves, or because like something's missing if they don't achieve a certain amount. And I think part of what's going on with the kind of person that you mentioned, in some cases it might well be that they're sort of that they're not aware of the potential they could have if they pushed themselves. I think that's true. But it's also, in at least some cases, people I know who just don't actually need this sort of extra thing of the sense of achievement to feel like they are allowed to exist in the world and just sort of move through their days and enjoy themselves. Now, as I've sort of hinted already earlier in this conversation, what I'm trying to do in my books, I think, is help insecure overachievers find find peace of mind and feel okay about themselves without achieving anything, but at the same time take that as the ground for then going and achieving a whole lot of stuff because it's fun to do so, and because we are personalities for whom actually that is one of the most fun ways to spend a finite time on Earth. For as long as you're doing it with that kind of anxious insecurity, you're not actually honouring the part of your personality that really wants to sort of exuberantly get cool stuff done in the world. You're turning it into this whole sort of insecurity drama. And I think there are some people who, when they realise this, think, okay, then I won't keep trying to do any of this stuff. I don't actually want to. I want to kick back. But there are plenty of people, and so far on my journey, it's been my experience and myself as well, that when you get a bit less anxious about it and you begin to think, okay, if I didn't do anything today, it wouldn't mean that I was a terrible person. You still then want to do stuff, because like just acting in the world and experimenting with new ideas and stuff is something that makes us feel alive. I think that's the way to think about it. It's a sort of synthesis of the two ideas.
Yeah. I want to end our conversation today at the end, right? In closing the book, you write, you might never change your life at all, and that's fine. This idea that we might always be plagued by the same problems, the same self-doubt, the same feelings that we're not doing enough, that we're not being enough until our very last moment on Earth. And so hopefully ending on somewhat of a reassuring note. We're not going to do everything we want to do. We're not going to become everything we hoped we would become. And that's okay, right?
Yeah, and I think this follows directly on from what we were just talking about, right? It's two layers to this, really. It's fine if you never change. It's fine if you never get to the places that you're feeling driven towards getting. That's just okay. And it might be a pity in some respect, but it is not a judgment or a verdict on your sort of right to exist on the planet or something. It's amazing how existential this gets. But the second layer, actually realizing that and understanding that, is the path to doing the most accomplishments that you're capable of. It's when you sort of can put this notion that there's something you've got to get to or a problem you've got to fix out of the way. That's when you can actually make the right choices about what to focus on, right? Because you're no longer entangled in like, well, how do I become twice as efficient as I am now? Like, forget that. Just ask, what would be the most sort of needle moving and interesting and absorbing things to do today? And actually the latter is the way to build businesses and write books and, all the rest of it. So I don't think this is a win-win situation, really, right? To realize that you don't have to change, that you don't have to achieve all these things, is also actually the surest way to achieve them.
Oliver, I've really enjoyed this. Thank you. I'm going to make sure that your new book, Meditations for Mortal, is linked in the show notes below. If people want to go elsewhere to find your writing or to learn more about you, where can they go?
The book is obviously anywhere you buy books or audiobooks. And then, my website, oliverburkeman.com, has you can sign up for my newsletter there and all the rest of it.